Hey everyone, welcome back. It's time for another deep dive. And today we're going to be tackling this Israel-Hamas ceasefire that just got announced.
Yeah. Big news.
Huge news.
Yeah.
It's kind of wild how this whole thing has unfolded, especially since it spans across two presidencies, which you don't really see that often in these kind of situations.
Yeah. It's certainly unusual.
Yeah.
It speaks to the complexity of the situation.
For sure. And we've got this Fox News article from January 15th, 2025, laying it all out.
Okay.
So we're going to dig into that and kind of try to, break down what's really going on here. So to start off, what really jumped out at me was this two-phased approach to the ceasefire. Have you seen that before in these types of conflicts?
I mean, it's not completely unheard of. It's definitely a way to try to address some really specific challenges, like, you need to build trust sort of in stages,
right,
and make sure everyone's on board with the ultimate goal.
It's almost like you're building a bridge, across this huge divide.
Exactly. You need that initial structure to get things moving before you can really start working on a permanent solution.
Okay, so let's talk about that initial structure then. What exactly is happening in this phase one? The article mentions it's about 6 weeks long.
Right, about 6 weeks. And it's a whole sequence of events that have to happen in a very specific order.
Yeah.
It all starts with a full ceasefire.
Okay.
Both sides agreeing to, put down the weapons, basically.
Okay.
And then Israel starts to withdraw its forces from those populated areas of Gaza.
Gotcha. And then this is where things get really interesting, right? Because there's the hostage release.
Absolutely. This is a huge part of the deal. And it's incredibly complex. You've got American hostages who are obviously a top priority for the U.S.
Right.
But then there are also Palestinian prisoners that Israel has agreed to release.
Yeah.
And they're even supposed to be releasing women, the elderly and wounded, as part of this.
Yeah. And you can tell just from reading Biden's statements how much this hostage situation weighs on him.
Oh, for sure. It's a very human element to this whole geopolitical situation.
Yeah. He even said, let me see, I've got the quote here. And I'm proud to say Americans will be part of that hostage release and phase one as well. And the vice president and I cannot wait to welcome them home.
Yeah, that really underscores the personal stakes involved here.
For sure. And it's not just about the Americans either, right? The deal also includes Israel releasing hundreds of Palestinian prisoners.
That's right. It's about trying to create a sense of reciprocity.
Yeah.
Showing both sides that they're getting something out of this.
It's like they're trying to build momentum, you know, some tangible progress to make this whole idea of lasting peace a little less abstract.
Exactly. It's about changing the dynamic, showing people that things can change, and building some much-needed goodwill along the way.
So phase one is about building that bridge. But what about the other side of the chasm? What happens after those 6 weeks? What's the long game here with phase two?
Phase two, that's where they really aim for a permanent end to the war. But it's also where things get really, really tricky, because the negotiations for that haven't even started yet.
Oh, wow. So we're basically standing on the edge of this cliff, not knowing what's on the other side.
Pretty much. And even Biden acknowledged that uncertainty. He said, if negotiations take longer than 6 weeks, the ceasefire will continue as long as the negotiations continue.
It kind of sounds like a veiled threat, doesn't it?
It definitely adds pressure to the situation.
Yeah.
What happens if they can't reach an agreement in those 6 weeks? Does everything just fall apart?
We're back to square one.
It's a very real possibility. And that uncertainty is hanging over the entire process.
Speaking of pressure, we can't forget about Trump and what he said before leaving office.
Oh, yeah.
He warned that there would be hell to pay if those hostages weren't released before his inauguration. Do you think that played any role in the timing of this deal?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's certainly an interesting thing to consider how that public pressure from Trump might have factored in.
It's like another layer of complexity in this already complex situation.
Absolutely. And keep in mind, this whole ceasefire was negotiated during a transition between administrations, which is incredibly rare. And then, of course, you've got that moment in the press conference when Biden's asked if Trump deserves credit for the deal.
Oh, yeah.
And he just shoots back with, is that a joke? I mean, come on.
Well, it makes for a good soundbite. It's important to remember that despite all the public back and forth, there was some behind-the-scenes collaboration happening. The State Department actually acknowledged that the Trump team played a role in the negotiations.
I think they even said something like, it's super unusual to see that level of cooperation between an outgoing an incoming administration on something this sensitive.
Yeah, it was something like, I don't know if it's unprecedented to have envoys from an outgoing and an incoming administration sitting at the same table negotiating a ceasefire agreement of this kind. But if it's not unprecedented, it's certainly unusual.
Wow. So you've got these two administrations who, publicly are at odds with each other, but behind closed doors, they're actually working together to try to get this deal done.
It really shows you the urgency of the situation. Both sides recognized that they needed to work together, at least to some extent, to make this ceasefire happen. So we've got this carefully constructed two-phased approach. Phase one, trying to de-escalate things and build a foundation for more lasting peace in phase two. But there are all these questions looming, like, how long will this actually last?
Yeah.
Will they be able to reach a real agreement in phase two?
And what happens if they don't?
Exactly. What happens if it all falls apart?
It's a very delicate balancing act, and we're only just at the beginning of the story.
That's for sure. All right, so we're back. And we've talked about phase one, this kind of like bridge to a more lasting peace. But phase two, that's where the real heavy lifting starts, right? The permanent solution part.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not going to be easy, though.
No, definitely not. So what are they walking into here? What are some of the biggest obstacles they'll have to face in these negotiations?
Well, imagine walking into a room and it's just filled with decades of baggage.
Oh, boy.
That's kind of what this is like. It's not just about, drawing lines on a map or hammering out the details in agreement. It's about addressing these deep-rooted issues that have fueled this conflict for generations.
Wow. Okay, so give me an example. What kind of baggage are we talking about here? What are some of those big sticking points that have been so hard to resolve in the past?
Well, you've got the status of Jerusalem, for one, a city that's sacred to both Israelis and Palestinians.
Right.
Figuring out how to share that, how to ensure access and rights for both sides, that's always been a major point of contention.
And then there's the issue of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, right?
Absolutely. Palestinians see those settlements as encroaching on their land, and it's a huge obstacle to creating a viable Palestinian state.
And what about the Palestinian refugees who were displaced in past conflicts?
That's another one. The right of return for those refugees is something that's incredibly important to the Palestinian side, and it's something that Israel has been very reluctant to concede.
So basically all those thorny questions that have been plaguing this conflict for decades.
Exactly. And it's not just about history either. You also have to consider the current political realities. Both the Israeli and Palestinian leaders are under pressure from different factions within their own societies.
Right. So any concession they make could be seen as a betrayal by some segment of their own people.
Exactly. It's a very delicate balancing act. They have to try to find common ground with the other side while also navigating those internal pressures.
And then on top of all that, you have to factor in the regional dynamics. All those other countries who have a stake in what happens in the Middle East.
Right. Countries like Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, they all have their own interests, and their influence could either help or hinder the peace process.
So it's like a giant chess game with all these different players making moves.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
For instance, Egypt has a long history of mediating between Israel and Hamas.
Right.
They want stability on their border, so they'll likely be pushing for a lasting agreement. But then you have Jordan, who has a large Palestinian population. So they're particularly sensitive to issues like the status of Jerusalem and the right of return. Their stance could be really crucial in these negotiations.
Okay, so this ceasefire, it's not happening in a vacuum.
Not at all. It's really just one piece of a much bigger, a much more complicated puzzle.
And that puzzle is the Middle East itself.
Exactly. A region grappling with historical grievances, political instability, and these competing visions for the future.
So we've talked about the leaders and the politics and the history. But what about the everyday people living in Israel and Gaza? What does all of this actually mean for them?
That's the most important question, isn't it? Yeah. At the end of the day, it's about people's lives.
Absolutely.
People on both sides have endured years of violence and fear. Imagine living under the constant threat of rockets or airstrikes, the constant worry of losing loved ones.
It's unimaginable.
If this ceasefire holds and if those negotiations actually lead to a lasting peace agreement, it could finally break that cycle.
It would be transformative, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. It would allow people to finally breathe a sigh of relief, to start rebuilding their lives, and to start planning for the future without the constant shadow of conflict hanging over them.
And it's not just about the absence of violence, right? It's also about creating the conditions for a better life. Exactly. For Palestinians, it's about economic opportunity, freedom of movement, and having a say in their own future. For Israelis, it's about ensuring their security while also living in a society that upholds justice and equality.
So peace, it's not just about putting down weapons.
Right. It's about creating a future where everyone can thrive.
But what if this ceasefire falls apart? What if those negotiations break down? Are we looking at a return to violence?
It's definitely a possibility. If they can't address those underlying issues, if both sides feel like they're not being heard or that their needs aren't being met, then the frustration could easily boil over. And that's a scenario no one wants to see.
It feels like we're standing at a fork in the road.
Yeah.
One path leads towards a brighter future.
Hope.
Right, hope.
Right.
The other path leads right back into the darkness. And the decisions made in these Phase 2 negotiations, those decisions will determine which path we end up on.
It's a pivotal moment, not just for Israel and Palestine, but for the entire region. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. But there's one more piece of this puzzle that we need to talk about, America's role in all of this.
Yeah, the U.S. is a major player in this conflict.
Yeah.
You can't really talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict without talking about the U.S.
So how would you describe their role? What are they trying to achieve here?
Well, they wear a lot of hats. They're a mediator, a power broker, a provider of aid to both sides.
And they have a long history of involvement in the region, right?
Absolutely. And that history comes with a lot of baggage, too. But at the end of the day, the U.S. wants to see stability and security in the Middle East.
Which makes sense. It's a strategically important region for them.
Exactly. And they also want to maintain their strong alliance with Israel, which is, a key strategic partner in the region.
Right. But at the same time, they also want to see a resolution to the Palestinian issue.
Exactly. And that's where things get tricky, because those two goals sometimes seem to be at odds with each other.
It's like they're walking a tightrope, trying to keep everyone happy.
And then you have to throw in U.S. domestic politics into the mix. Different groups within the U.S. have very different views on this conflict, and that inevitably influences how the U.S. acts on the world stage.
So it's not just about what's happening in the Middle East, it's also about what's happening in Washington.
Absolutely. It's all interconnected.
So if we put ourselves in the U.S.'s shoes for a minute, what's their game plan here with this ceasefire?
Well, in the short term, their main priority is to prevent things from escalating again. They want this ceasefire to hold to give those Phase 2 negotiations a chance.
So like a referee making sure everyone plays by the rules.
Exactly. But it's more than just keeping the peace temporarily. The U.S. still believes in this long-term vision of a two-state solution.
An independent Palestinian state alongside Israel living peacefully side by side.
That's been the goal of U.S. foreign policy for decades.
But it's been a really elusive goal.
It has. But if this ceasefire holds and those negotiations are successful, it could be a real opportunity to make some progress towards that vision.
So this is about more than just ending one conflict.
Yeah, it's about trying to break a cycle of violence that's been going on for generations.
And maybe creating a future where both Israelis and Palestinians can actually thrive.
That's the hope.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've talked about the details of the ceasefire, the historical context, the challenges facing the negotiators, and the role of the U.S.
It's a complex situation.
For sure. But hopefully you've come away from this feeling a little more informed about what's at stake.
And maybe even a little more hopeful for the future.
That's what we're always aiming for. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.